Hello, everyone. This is Professor Joseph Holbrook. I am in Columbia, Maryland with my wife. I'm enjoying a beautiful summer up here and preparing for my courses for this fall. So this is American History, AMH 2020, American History, U.S. History since 1877, otherwise known as Modern American History. So we will not be talking about the Civil War in this course. So here's a basic timeline. I need my coffee here. It's in the middle of the afternoon and I have my sleepy time coming up. So the timeline from 1869, I guess, to 1905, we're going to be focusing on capital and labor. This was a period of intense expansion of American industry and the formation of a number of big businesses. Big business doesn't do it justice. Humongous business, let's put it that way. Industry, in the railroad industry, in the steel industry, and meat packing, and a lot of innovation in terms of business practices, which then kickstarts a reaction of the rise of the labor movement to try to protect labor from being exploited. So one of the first labor movements was the Knights of Labor, founded in 1869 in Philadelphia. They were unique in that they fully incorporated women into their labor movement as well as men. They were predominant until about the 1880s as the predominant labor union. Andrew Carnegie got started with steelworks in Pittsburgh. There was a panic in 1873. This brings up an issue that there's, when we talk about the Great Depression, that implies that there have been many depressions. Most of them are not that bad, but except for the Great Depression, like the Great War, is exceptional. And so these panics or recessions or depressions happen in a cyclical nature. If you look through U.S. history, it's part of the capitalist cycle. And so that was 1873. There was an economic depression, more than a recession. Also, the first department store began in Philadelphia around 1875. Good coffee. Baltimore and Ohio workers initiated a nationwide railroad strike in 1877. The first refrigerator car was introduced in 1878. A businessman by the name of Jay Gould begins to build the Missouri Pacific Railway system. Eventually, in 1883, the railroads get their act together and established national time zones. You can imagine how confusing it would be to be traveling by rail across the United States without any kind of systematic time zones. Then you end up with a period of intense labor conflict, almost a war between labor and business. 1886 was the Haymarket Square bombing in Chicago, which resulted in the execution of several anarchists who were probably innocent. The American Federation of Labor was founded around that same year. The Homestead Steel Strike crushed workers and a wave of minor strikes broke out. 1893, there was another panic. You notice that was a 20-year period. These recessions, depressions, panics tend to happen about every 20 years throughout U.S. history. So when was the last one that we've had? 2008? Well, you do the math. Surge of railroad bankruptcies, reorganization by investment bankers. President Cleveland sends in troops, federal troops, to break the Pullman boycott, which made a huge impression on the young Eugene Debs. Then we have a European immigration, immigrating to the United States to fill labor needs. Frederick Taylor formulated scientific management philosophy of business, which was one of the most soul-crushing approaches to manufacturing ever invented. And we'll talk about that. Eugene V. Debs helped found the Socialist Party of America, and the industrial workers of the world united in the IWW, who were called affectionately the Wobblies. So this is a period when industrial capitalism is triumphant. Cheers to industrial capitalism. By the way, this is just coffee. Bustelo coffee, actually, Cuban coffee. In the 19th century, there was a great deflation. Worldwide prices fell steadily. In England, there was an economic decline. In the U.S., industrial expansion went into high gear. Real income for Americans increased 50% from 1877 to 1900. The wages increased from $388 to $573 per year per head per person. That's not very much money by today's terms, but it was a major increase of income. This was the age of steel. So factories were multiplying in the U.S. Railroads needed locomotives and steel tracks. American industry was driven primarily by the production of capital goods such as machinery. Cities needed trolley lines, sanitation systems, and commercial structures. There was a revolution, technical revolution in the process of steel making. The large iron industry already existed, but in 1856 an inventor designed a refining furnace called the Bessemer furnace or converter that produced steel. Steel was stronger and cheaper than iron. And Andrew Carnegie was the first to fully exploit this technology in the United States. And here you see wholesale prices dropping from 1869 through, it looks like it reached its low in 1890. But the GDP, that is the gross domestic per capita, gross domestic production, I forget what the P stands for. I'm sorry about that. But the income, basically, the per person increased steadily from 1869 through 1900, even as wholesale prices were coming down. That's always a good thing. If prices are coming down and income is going up, you could be happy. This is a picture of Andrew Carnegie sitting at his desk. And then we have the railroad boom. So before the Civil War, shipping had been done predominantly through ships on the water, through rivers. But after the Civil War, locomotives began arriving in Britain and the United States. And in 1860, a network of tracks crisscrossed the eastern half of the country. Railroads became the most important form of transportation. But the issue was who would raise the capital. It required an immense amount of capital investment to build railroads. Who's going to pay for that? And so around this time, the idea of the corporation was invented to raise private capital with limited liability. In other words, if I'm going to invest several $1 million in an enterprise in my name, if it goes broke, then I lose the money. But if I'm part of a corporation and the corporation invests money, then I can protect some of my assets and I can protect myself from legal suits. So the corporation provided limited liability for investors. And this is a picture of Cornelius Vanderbilt. So we saw Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt. This is the age of the robber barons, of the big oil and steel and railroad tycoons. Similar to what we have today with the tech tycoons, the tech barons, or the tech titans. I'll get it right. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with the fortune he made in steamboats and began building railroads. I believe he was the one that tried to build a canal across Nicaragua, if I'm not mistaken. And here you see railroad lines. between 1870 to 1890. The green lines were the major rail lines in 1870, and then you can see additional lines were built, the red, from 1870 to 1890, basically after the Civil War. So you can see the major spread of railroads by looking at the red lines. You see one green line east and west across Utah into California. That was the first one built across the United States. But then very quickly you have railroad lines springing up everywhere. And here's another one of the titans of industry, Gustavus E. Swift. He built a mass production in meat packing. He created a new kind of enterprise, a vertically integrated firm capable of encompassing within its own structure all the functions of an industry. Gustavus E. Swift, of Swift Meatpacking. Vertical integration. Remember that term. So vertical integration. Here's a picture of one of his railroad cars. So he not only bought the pigs and the cows and had them butchered and processed, but he also shipped them through his own railroad cars. And he achieved this oligopoly, which is a market dominance by a few, through vertical integration. Swift cut prices and drove independent distributors out of business. Does this remind you of anything today? Who was driving out bookstores out of business about 10 or 12 years ago? I'm surprised Barnes & Nobles is still in business, but they do have a lively online component as well as their stores. But that would be Amazon. So Amazon started out as a bookseller. When I first began ordering from Amazon, it was strictly books. And now Amazon has diversified its market in almost every possible area you can imagine. If I find something at Home Depot that I want, I often will go order it on Amazon. And so Amazon also has vertical integration because they could have relied on FedEx or the U.S. Postal Service or UPS to deliver their products, but instead they developed their own delivery service, Amazon Prime. You've seen their trucks all over the place. And basically it's one vertical enterprise from the manufacture of items to the delivery of the items. So Jeff Bezos, a high school boy from Miami, has been brilliant at applying these ideas from the 19th century to the 20th century. Then there's the petroleum industry. Rural Americans had long noticed pools of petroleum oozing up from the earth. That reminded me of a TV show I used to watch as a kid. Back when I was growing up on the farm, it was called the Beverly Hillbillies, 1962. And it starts out with the banjo playing and a silly song about black gold, Texas tea, oil that is. And you see a picture there from Beverly Hillbillies of oil bubbling up on land that made him a millionaire. John D. Rockefeller, another major titan of industry. He started out as a 24-year-old grain dealer, but he plunged into the oil business, and within a few years he owned Standard Oil Company of Ohio in Cleveland, Ohio. Became established a wealthy dynasty. The Rockefellers were very involved in politics when I was growing up. The Rockefeller Center in New York. And then there was a development of mass marketing strategies. Montgomery and Sears and Roebuck developed huge mail order enterprises. Woolworth and A&P opened chains of stores. So you see here in the pictures, Montgomery Ward magazine. my family, we lived on a farm, grew up on a farm, and my family used to get the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Instead of going to Google or Amazon and searching for the item you wanted, you would go into the catalog and just go to the index and find, if you're looking for tools, for clothes, household items, they had it all. And you could order it and it would come to your house. And then here's cereal. I eat it by the trunk full too. So this is an advertisement for Kellogg's cereal. And this is the beginning of the era of mass advertising and marketing. Rue the day. Advertisements on TV are the bane of my life. Sorry about that. It's personal commentary. I always pause them or fast forward them if I can. So here you see railroads crisscrossing the country. The light green areas are cotton growing regions. The sort of peach color is tobacco growing regions. Then the bluish areas are coal and iron mining. And then there's a diagonal slash, which is textile manufacturing. And you see it's predominantly in northern Georgia and in South Carolina. In southern industry, was focused a lot on textile mills in terms of labor and race. Extractive industries like logging and iron processing tended to hire both blacks and whites without much distinction. During this period, there was a great expansion of immigration to the United States from Europe. 1 million Irish people immigrated to the United States because of the Irish potato famine. The English came as miners, the Germans as machinists, the Belgians as glass workers. Heavy, low-paid labor became the domain of Hungarians, Poles, and other ethnic groups. In terms of gender and labor, there were 4 million women working for wages in 1900, mostly young and single. Oftentimes, if a woman became pregnant, she would be fired immediately, because the assumption was that a pregnant worker or a mother would not be as reliable as a single woman. Then there was some autonomous labor, where you had, at that time, some miners worked on their own, and they were paid according to their production rather than in wages. Here we go with American immigration from 1870 to 1914. You see the red line is Northern Europeans, which gradually slacks off around 1900, then spikes up a little bit. But the great increase around 1895 was in Southern Europeans. That would be Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, Southern Europe. Of course, there was also immigration from Mexico. Autonomous labor. The dispersal of authority was characteristic of 19th century industry. The top workers enjoyed a high degree of autonomy. Mass production came into being during this century. Machine tools that skilled workers used eventually became dedicated machines set up to do the same job over and over, eliminating the need for skilled operators. In the 17th or 18th centuries, a shoemaker was an artisan, and they would build a shoe from beginning to end and take pride in the work of art that they produced, good quality handmade shoes. But with mass production, shoes began to be made on an assembly line, and you might have one person pulling down a lever with a punch to punch out the soles, and that's all he would do. He would punch out the soles, even as this assembly line killed his soul or crushed his soul. So this was mass production. One person would do the same job over and over, and workers began to be viewed as replaceable, interchangeable and replaceable, like the items they were making. Hence, this would create a backlash of working people. The breaker boys were coal mining workers whose job was to separate impurities from coal. The use of breaker boys began in the mid-1860s. You see these young boys over there on the right in the picture. They look like they're 11, 12, 13, 14 maybe. Public disapproval of the employment of children as breaker boys existed by the mid-1880s. However, if you don't find a way to put pressure on the titans of industry, they will look for every possible angle to save money and decrease costs and increase profits. The practice didn't end until the 1920s. This brings us to scientific management, a very unfortunate name. It kind of gives science a bad name. Frederick W. Taylor suggested scientific management in order to extract greater productivity from workers. He first proposed that in order to be more productive, you should eliminate all brain work from manual labor. It should be repetitive and simple so anybody could do it with half a brain. Second, withdraw the authority that workers exercised in the shop floor. The workers should be told what to do. They should be a cog in the wheel. They shouldn't have any self-management or self-initiative. This would force them to obey promptly and without asking questions. You can see where that's headed, right? Not good. And so this created a backlash in the American labor movement, which began around this time, 1869, 1870, and went through the early part of the 20th century before World War I with a good deal of violence and conflict. The first organization was the Knights of Labor, which was founded in Philadelphia. They were very successful at including women as well as men, blacks and whites, and they tended to be somewhat utopian in their approach. The trade union was a more practical kind of workers' organization that focused on everyday needs. So the Knights of Labor, here's another picture of the industries of, I can't read it, the industry, by industry we thrive. So this is a caption on a union card. It was the core principle of the Knights of Labor that everything of value is the product of honest labor. So you see these workers, it's kind of idealistic. The picture of the Grand Master workman Terence B. Powderly hangs on the wall, benignly watching. So this was the first organization of its kind to come along. Then you get trade unions. I keep moving myself around here. National trade unions began around 1852 with the International Typographical Union. By the 1870s, molders, ironworkers, bricklayers, and others also organized national trade unions. By the 1886, 50,000 women belonged to the Knights of Labor. And it wasn't long before another trade union emerged, the AFL. Samuel Gompers was a Dutch-Jewish cigar maker and was a worker intellectual who gravitated to radical circles. He developed a doctrine called pure and simple unionism. And here are the Haymarket riots of 1886. It's a picture of it. This was genuinely deplorable violence. There was a riot. The police were gathered around the stage. There were speakers. Some of the leaders of the protests were philosophical anarchists. Someone threw a bomb. Several policemen were killed. The policemen began to fire. And after it was all said and done, the anarchists were blamed and 4 of them were hanged. However, evidence since then has never proven that they were responsible for the bomb. It was likely someone else. But the business leaders wanted to blame them and try to intimidate and control the anarchists. Then there was the Homestead Strike of 1892. Also very violent and very intense. And then finally the Pullman Strike of 1894. This was against the Pullman car was an invention of, oh, hang on a second, I need to get down here in my notes. Can't remember all this stuff without notes. Okay, here we go. The Haymarket riots were in Chicago, by the way. Left 4 strikers dead. employers went on the offensive. Let me back up to the Hay. That's the Haymarket. Compiled blacklist of strikers. They forced unions to sign yellow dog contracts, which they would agree to work through a strike. Trade unions found it tough going after Haymarket riots. Then you had industrial, and the Homestead strike was a attempt by Carnegie to eliminate the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers in Homestead, Pennsylvania, in order to lower his costs. Strikers opened fire on Pinkerton's. Pinkerton's was a detective agency or security agency. So the strikers opened fire on the Pinkertons, who were hired to take possession of the steelworks. So this begins a decade of industrial war between corporate industry and workers. And you can find lots of information about all this online and on YouTube. Pullman, Illinois was a model factory. The town's sole employer was George Pullman, who was the inventor of the sleeping car. You hear what I said, right? The sole employer of an entire town. That would be a vulnerable town, I would think. So Pullman cut wages, but he refused to cut the rents. So you're making less money, but you still have to pay the same money for the house that you rent, which is owned by the guy you work for. You see our dilemma here? So in May 1894, the Pullman workers went on strike. They belonged to the American Railway Union, which was led by a young man by the name of Eugene V. Debs, who would later run for president and become famous as the perennial presidential candidate who was a socialist. The railroads drew the federal government into the dispute. The Pullman boycott failed because of the naked use of government power. So Eugene Debs was the future leader of American socialism, which is kind of a dirty word now since World War II. Before World War II, socialism was not really such a bad word in American psyche. Not even communism is necessarily a bad word in the 1920s and 1930s. For one thing, the Russian communists, the Soviet communists, were our allies against fascism in World War II. But after World War II, with the beginning of the Cold War, which we'll be getting into later, the United States Americans experienced a social trauma throughout 30 years of the Cold War, and communism became the boogeyman, the great threat. So Eugene Debs was elected National Secretary in 1880. The Pullman strike visibly changed Debs. After 6 months in prison, he emerged radicalized. I hate it when that happens. When you go to prison and emerge radicalized. Here's some troops breaking up the Pullman strike. This brings us to syndicalism. Oh, I should say that Debs got involved in the socialist movement in 1897, and he revolted against the old Socialist Party and launched a new pragmatic Socialist Party of America in 1903. He ran repeatedly for president in the presidential elections. Socialism actually spread throughout the U.S. with his influence, especially in Texas, Oklahoma, and Minnesota. Distressed farmers and poor workers were often open to this message. And the Western Federation of Miners was another labor union that went on strike in 1892. They engaged in actual running gun battles with company guards. They were pretty radical, the Western Federation of Miners. And they later joined with the left-wing socialists to create a new movement called the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, nicknamed the Wobblies. The Wobblies fervently supported the Marxist class struggle in the workplace. Correcting spelling as I go. They believed in a general strike as a path to social revolution. In other words, they weren't particularly political. They didn't really care who was president of the United States. They weren't trying to take control in Congress. They were trying to come to power through the class struggle in the workplace through strikes. This philosophy was called syndicalism. And from 1877 to 1900, in summary, the new approach to scientific management was dehumanizing and soul-crushing, but it also led to further de-skilling of workers, and the reaction that it provoked was the American labor system, which arose in order to advocate for collective bargaining and protect American workers. There was an intense industrial warfare in the 1890s, resulting in new labor radicalism leading to both socialism of Eugene Debs and to the radical industrialism of the IWW. I don't recall at this moment, it's back in my notes, but when Labor Day, the Labor Day weekend, can be attributed to one of the strikes, one of the bloody strikes of the 1890s. Okay, that's about it for today. It's good to talk to you. We're off and running with this semester in modern American history, and I look forward to each lesson with you. Thank you very much.